The dull, flickering fluorescent lights cast an eerie glow over the cold concrete walls of the prison. The air was thick with the heavy scent of sweat, metal, and fear, a constant reminder that this place was far from a sanctuary. The clanging of gates echoed through the corridors as guards walked past with a steady, mechanical rhythm, their boots clicking against the stone floors like the ticking of an ominous clock. This was not a place for hope. It was a place for broken dreams and lost futures. Yet amid the cold indifference of the walls, one man stood out, a figure carved by years of experience, his eyes sharp and calculating. Marcus "Tank" Daniels had been here longer than he cared to admit. Once a Navy SEAL, one of the most respected operatives in his field, now reduced to a number on a wall and a shadow of his former self. He was the kind of man who could blend into any situation, who had survived the darkest corners of the world, only to find himself trapped in a cell with no escape in sight. His reputation, though long forgotten by most, had left an invisible mark on this place, an air of mystery that hung over him like a cloud. Most of the inmates avoided his gaze, the kind of unspoken respect that came from knowing you were in the presence of someone who had seen and done things most men couldn't even fathom. But there were whispers, the kind that slithered through the cracks in the walls hidden behind the prison's prison walls, murmured from one corner to the next. Whispers about a man who might still have connections, a man who was more than just a forgotten soul in a cell. Some were fearful, others were curious. None dared to approach him. Yet, despite the attempts to ignore him, a growing tension surrounded Marcus. Something was shifting, something darker than the typical prison politics. He could feel it even if he couldn't quite place it yet. The way the guards were acting differently, more watchful, more cautious. The strange men who would occasionally appear on the perimeter of the yard, their eyes scanning him with an intensity he hadn't seen in years. They were watching him, and the whispers were growing louder. The prison itself seemed to be changing too. The usual calm had been replaced with a creeping unease, and the sense of unease was palpable as Marcus sat alone in the yard, watching the horizon fade into dusk. The stillness around him was interrupted by a figure entering his line of sight. The man stood tall, dressed in dark clothing, his posture rigid, the air of someone with a purpose. He stared at Marcus for a moment too long, and though he didn't move, Marcus could feel the weight of his gaze like a leaden weight on his chest. And then there were the rumors that trickled through the prison's network. Word had it that a cartel was moving in, setting up operations within the prison. But why? Marcus didn't buy the official line, not for a second. The cartel didn't usually target places like this. They didn't waste time with low-level prisoners. No, something else was at play here. His instincts told him that the game was far bigger than anyone realized. But who was pulling the strings? Why would they be interested in a former Navy SEAL who hadn't seen active duty in years? He didn't have to wait long for the answers. As the night fell, a low hum of activity rippled through the prison. Marcus could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the rising tide of something terrible about to unfold. He didn't know how, but he knew the storm was coming. His heart raced as he thought about the men who had been watching him, their motives unclear. What did they want? And why now? The moment of clarity hit him like a slap to the face. The cartel. They had come for him, though they had no idea who they were dealing with. They didn't know that Marcus Daniels wasn't just a former prisoner. They didn't know that the man they thought was a forgotten relic was, in fact, a legendary Navy SEAL with a past that could shatter them all. In the dim light of his cell, Marcus stood, his muscles tensing as the weight of the situation settled in. He wasn't sure who was behind this, but one thing was clear. This wouldn't end in some backroom deal or quiet takedown. The time for hiding was over. The game had changed, and Marcus was about to find himself in the middle of something far bigger than he had ever imagined. Just as he took a step toward the door, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, too many to be mere guards. Marcus froze, his breath catching in his throat. He could feel their presence closing in, the tension thickening in the air. They were coming for him. But what did they know? What did they want? And what was he about to do to stop them? Before he could make a move, the door to his cell rattled, and a voice, a low, menacing growl, came from the other side. "Daniels," it called, a name laced with contempt. "We need to talk." Marcus took a deep breath. Whatever this was, it had just become personal. Marcus leaned against the cold concrete wall, his fingers brushing the surface of the worn-out bed frame as he tried to steady his thoughts. His past had been filled with moments of intense pride and crushing defeat, each shaping the man he had become. As a Navy SEAL, he had fought in places most men couldn't even pronounce, let alone understand. His mind was a catalog of missions and men he had lost, faces etched in his memory like a permanent scar. But none of that had prepared him for the quiet weight of prison life, the slow, suffocating sense of being forgotten. For years, the only battles he'd fought were with the ghosts of his past, the ones that whispered in his ear at night, reminding him of the mistakes he couldn't undo. He'd tried to forget, tried to suppress the images of his former comrades, those he had failed to save. His mind kept circling back to one mission, one pivotal moment. They had been on a covert operation in Eastern Europe, and everything that could go wrong had gone wrong. There was one man, his best friend, Lieutenant Michael Price, who didn't make it out alive. Marcus could still hear the sound of his voice on the radio calling for help just before the line went dead. That was the day Marcus stopped being the man he once was. That was the day he died in the field, only to awaken in a cold prison cell years later, shackled by his own guilt and the weight of his past. The quiet hum of the prison's overhead lights was a constant reminder of his isolation. The events of the day had left him restless, like a wolf caged and pacing for a chance to escape. He could feel the subtle changes in the air, the shift in the rhythm of the prison. The usual murmur of prisoners was now laced with a tension that was almost palpable. The whispers had grown louder, more frequent, and Marcus knew that something was about to break. He had seen it before. When fear ran rampant through the population, it was only a matter of time before it turned into violence. "Hey, Tank," came a voice, low and hesitant. Marcus didn't have to turn to know who it was. It was Javier, a younger inmate who had been trying to get in Marcus's good graces for weeks. Javier was a former street gang member who had somehow ended up behind bars on a drug charge. Though he was eager to be part of Marcus's circle, the older man had always kept him at arm's length. Marcus didn't need more people in his life, not after everything that had happened. "Yeah?" Marcus responded, his tone flat but not unkind. He wasn't about to give this kid false hope. "You hear about the new arrivals?" Javier asked, his voice dropping lower. "Some serious people, man. Word is they're looking for someone specific." Marcus raised an eyebrow, though his expression remained unreadable. "Someone specific?" "Yeah, they're asking about you. They said your name." Javier shifted uncomfortably, casting a quick glance toward the guards to make sure they weren't listening. "They're the real deal, Tank. Cartel guys. They don't mess around." Marcus's heart skipped a beat, though he kept his face impassive. The mention of the cartel was no casual rumor. It was a reminder of how far-reaching the criminal underworld extended. The cartel wasn't just a group of thugs, they were a global operation with resources and power. And if they were after him, it meant something far worse was coming. Something bigger than what this prison could hold. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said, his voice low, careful. "Just stay out of it." But Javier wasn't buying it. His eyes darted back and forth, the fear in them palpable. "They're saying you're more than just some former soldier. They're talking about your past, about the things you did, the missions you were on. These guys, they know who you are." Marcus's gaze darkened, his hand clenching into a fist. He didn't want to hear about it. He didn't want anyone digging into his past. He'd spent years trying to bury it, trying to live a quiet life behind these prison walls. But the world didn't let you forget who you were, no matter how hard you tried. "You're better off forgetting you ever heard that, Javier," Marcus growled, his voice low with warning. The younger man seemed to sense the danger in his words and took a step back, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and respect. Marcus turned away, needing space, needing time to think. He couldn't stay here forever, but every day in this cell felt like a ticking bomb, the fuse getting shorter with each passing hour. The constant tension was suffocating, but there was no way out, not yet. As the night wore on, Marcus found himself walking the prison yard again, his mind racing. He caught sight of a few of the other inmates, huddled together in groups, their voices lowered to whispers. He couldn't escape the feeling that they were all looking at him, even when their eyes quickly darted away when they saw him approach. It wasn't paranoia. It was reality. The prison was shifting, and he could feel the darkness closing in around him. In the distance, a figure moved, out of the shadows, tall and imposing. It was the man from earlier, the one who had been watching him. This time, he wasn't alone. Two others flanked him, each wearing the same cold expression of someone who was used to making people disappear. Marcus's instincts flared, a mixture of dread and recognition. These weren't just cartel soldiers, they were something else. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized how far-reaching the danger had become. They knew too much. They had done their homework. And they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. The man stepped forward, his eyes locking with Marcus's. "Daniels," he said, his voice as cold as the prison itself. "We need to talk." Marcus clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. He had a feeling that this conversation wasn't going to end the way he hoped. What did they want with him? Why had they chosen him, of all people? Before he could respond, the sound of a heavy door opening echoed from behind him. Marcus turned just in time to see a guard step into the yard, a nervous look on his face. Something was wrong. This wasn't supposed to be happening. The tension in the air shifted once more as Marcus's mind raced with the realization that whatever was coming, he wouldn't be able to stop it alone. And the worst part was, he had no idea who was pulling the strings. The guard's footsteps echoed louder, now growing closer, filling the tense silence of the yard. Marcus could feel the cold prickle of sweat on the back of his neck as the man, the one who had been watching him, moved forward, his presence an oppressive weight in the air. The two others flanking him were just as menacing, their expressions, cold and unreadable, like stone statues that could shatter lives without a second thought. "Daniels," the man said again, his voice cutting through the thick silence. "You've been quite the ghost around here, haven't you?" Marcus straightened, his chest tightening as he met the man's gaze. He could feel his pulse quickening, but he refused to show any sign of weakness. His military training kicked in, years of learning to mask fear, to control his body and mind in the face of danger. This was just another mission, another threat to neutralize. "I don't know who you are or what you want," Marcus replied, his tone steady, but his mind raced. "But you're not going to find it here." The man smirked, his eyes glinting with a malicious gleam. "You still think you're in control, don't you, Daniels?" He stepped closer, closing the space between them, and the two men behind him flanked Marcus on either side. "That's what I like about you. So confident, so sure of yourself. But I don't think you fully understand the game you're playing." Marcus felt a flicker of doubt rise within him, though he quickly buried it. The situation was escalating quickly, and he needed to maintain his composure. He had survived countless missions under far worse circumstances, yet here he was, surrounded by these men in a place that should have been his sanctuary from the chaos of his past. But there was no peace here, no escape from the storm brewing around him. "You don't scare me," Marcus said through gritted teeth, though his body tensed, preparing for any sudden movement. The words were defiant, but deep inside, he knew that fear had its hold on him. There was something about these men, something far beyond the usual prison politics, something that felt too calculated, too cold. It was clear now that they weren't just looking for any man. They were after him specifically. The man chuckled, a low, menacing sound that sent chills down Marcus's spine. "Maybe not, but you will." He leaned in closer, his breath hot against Marcus's ear. "You see, Daniels, you've been living a lie all these years, hiding behind your past, but we know the truth. We know what you did, who you really are, and we're not going to let you pretend anymore." Marcus's stomach dropped as the words sank in. His mind raced, flashing back to his last mission, the one that had changed everything, the one that still haunted him in his nightmares. What had these men found out about him? How had they connected him to his past? "I don't know what you think you know," Marcus began, his voice strained but still controlled. "But you're making a big mistake. This is prison, your power here is limited." The man stepped back, a cruel smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, I don't think you understand, Daniels. We control more than just this prison. We have people on the outside, people who can make sure you never see the light of day again. People who know exactly how to get to you. And we don't care about the rules you think you've been following. You think you've been living some quiet life here? We're the ones who decide how this ends." Marcus's heart raced in his chest as the gravity of the situation hit him. These weren't just cartel thugs. This was something far more insidious. The cartel had resources, connections, and power. But these men, they were using him, playing a game with him, and they didn't care what it took to break him. He stepped back, trying to create distance between them. His mind was moving faster now, calculating every possible move, every contingency. But for the first time in a long while, doubt crept in. How had he gotten here? How had a man trained to survive in the harshest conditions found himself caged, vulnerable, at the mercy of men who were nothing like the enemies he had faced before? The man nodded at one of his associates, who stepped forward and handed him a manila folder. "This is for you," he said, pushing it into Marcus's chest. The weight of the folder felt like a death sentence in his hands. Marcus hesitated, looking up at the man. "What's in this?" he demanded. The man's smile widened, revealing a flash of teeth. "Your past, Daniels. Your mistakes. The ones you tried so hard to bury." Marcus's fingers trembled as he opened the folder, his heart sinking with each document. He scanned. The first few pages were filled with pictures from his past, from missions that were classified, but somehow someone had gotten hold of them. His heart skipped a beat as he turned the page. There was a picture of him and Lieutenant Price taken just before the fateful mission that had gone horribly wrong. It was a reminder of the man he couldn't save, the man who had died because Marcus had failed. His stomach churned as he read through the pages, each one a revelation he never wanted to see again. The documents detailed his training, his operations, the lives he had taken, the mistakes he had made. It was all there, laid out in black and white, proof of everything he had tried to leave behind. And these men knew it all. "You're not going anywhere, Daniels," the man said, his voice low and threatening. "You can't outrun your past." Marcus felt a wave of fury wash over him, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the folder. "I'm not who you think I am," he said through clenched teeth, trying to steady the rising anger in his chest. "I've moved past all that, but you're not getting away with this. You're making a big mistake." The man raised an eyebrow, unfazed by Marcus's outburst. "Am I? Or are you just too afraid to face the truth? You think you've been forgotten? But that's not how it works, Daniels. The past never stays buried." The words hit harder than any physical blow could. For a moment, Marcus felt a deep pang of doubt, as if everything he had ever believed about himself was slipping away. He had spent so long convincing himself that his past didn't define him, that he was more than the man he had been. But these men, these shadows of his past, were forcing him to confront everything he had buried deep inside. In the midst of the rising tension, a memory surged to the forefront of his mind. It was a moment from his childhood, before the military, before everything that had changed. His mother, standing in the kitchen with a soft smile on her face, had said something he'd never forgotten. "You're stronger than you think, Marcus. But strength isn't just about fighting. It's about knowing when to stand tall and when to walk away." That moment, that small piece of advice anchored him. It reminded him that he wasn't just some soldier who had been broken by his past. He was more than that, and as these men tried to chip away at his resolve, something inside him stirred. A quiet, fierce determination. He wasn't going down without a fight. He stood tall, meeting the man's cold gaze. "You've underestimated me," he said, his voice steady, And that's your first mistake. Just as the tension reached its peak, a distant sound echoed from across the yard. Footsteps, hurried and frantic. Marcus's eyes flickered toward the noise, and in that split second of distraction, the atmosphere shifted once more. Someone was coming, and it wasn't clear whether they were friend or foe. The man in front of him narrowed his eyes, his expression tightening. "This isn't over," he said through gritted teeth before turning and retreating, his associates following closely behind. Marcus exhaled, his heart pounding in his chest, but his mind was already racing. Who was coming? And how long did he have before the storm broke wide open? The danger was far from over, and Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. The prison yard had become a pressure cooker, the tension simmering just beneath the surface, waiting to explode. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that everything was slowly unraveling around him. The brief moments of clarity he'd found, the tiny victories he clung to, were rapidly slipping through his fingers like sand. Every breath felt heavier, as though the air itself was conspiring against him. The men who had confronted him earlier were just the beginning. He could feel the eyes of the cartel closing in, sensing that his every move was being watched, calculated. There was no safety in this place, no room for rest. He spent the days now walking the yard like a ghost, keeping his head down and his hands clenched at his sides, the weight of the manila folder still haunting him, the documents, the photos. Everything in them was a reminder of the man he used to be, a man who had lost himself in the violence of war. He thought he could leave that life behind, but these men were pulling him back into it. Each time he passed, the guards or a group of inmates, the whispers seemed louder, their eyes colder. No one spoke to him directly, but he could feel the isolation tightening around him, a noose that was slowly pulling tighter with each passing hour. The worst part was the feeling of helplessness that gnawed at him. The cartel was playing a different game, a game that didn't rely on brute force or weapons. It was psychological warfare. They knew how to break a man, how to dismantle him from the inside out, and Marcus was no exception. He found himself facing the cold, unfeeling eyes of the guards more and more often. They'd stop him in the halls, glance at him with a hint of suspicion, as if they could see something he was trying to hide. Some of them had been here long enough to recognize the signs of a man on the edge. Marcus wasn't the only one who could feel the tightening grip of something dark and dangerous surrounding them, but there was nothing he could do about it. The walls were closing in and he was trapped inside, unable to escape. Then came the night that broke him. The night the cartel made their next move. It started with a small, seemingly insignificant encounter. Marcus was alone in his cell when the door swung open. He expected one of the usual guards, maybe an errand or a routine check. Instead, it was the same man from before, the one who had delivered the manila folder, flanked by two others. The door slammed shut behind them, locking with an audible click that reverberated through Marcus's chest like a gunshot. "You've been quiet," the man said, his voice a low growl. He stepped into the room, closing the gap between them with each step, the sound of his boots against the concrete floor making Marcus's heart beat faster. Too quiet. Marcus stood there frozen for a moment, his fists instinctively clenching at his sides. He wasn't going to show fear, not this time. He had been through worse. He had faced the enemy in places far darker than this. But this was different. This was a game of patience, of subtle manipulation, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus wasn't sure he was winning. "I'm not hiding anything," Marcus said, his voice rough but steady. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. He had to keep his cool. The man laughed, a cruel sound that bounced off the walls. "Of course you're not. But we both know that's a lie, don't we?" His eyes gleamed with malice. "We know who you are, Daniels. And sooner or later, the truth always comes out." Without another word, the man motioned for his associates. One of them stepped forward, holding something in his hand, a phone. A simple object, yet it sent a wave of dread coursing through Marcus's veins. He had no idea how the cartel had gotten their hands on it, but the implications were clear. The phone was a tool, a means of control, a way to break him even further. The man who had been speaking to him reached out and handed Marcus the phone, his fingers brushing against Marcus's skin as he did so. The contact felt like a violation, a cold touch that made his skin crawl. "You'll want to see this," the man said, his voice almost playful, as though he were a cat toying with a mouse. "It's your past coming back to haunt you." Marcus's fingers trembled slightly as he took the phone, his stomach dropping as the screen lit up. There was no sound, but the image on the screen was clear, a grainy, distant shot of him, standing in the middle of a firefight in the mountains of Eastern Europe. The mission where everything had gone wrong, the mission where he had lost Price. His heart stopped. The camera zoomed in, and there in the chaos of the background was Lieutenant Price, alive, reaching out for him. But then the screen flickered, and the image shifted, showing a man who looked a lot like Marcus, standing over a body, his own reflection, smeared with blood. The phone dropped from his hand, clattering to the ground, but the image was seared into his mind. His past was no longer something he could escape. It was here, right in front of him, an accusation that tore at his soul. "You think you can outrun that?" the man asked softly, his voice full of venom. He knelt down and picked up the phone, casually swiping through more images, each one more damning than the last. "You're not a hero, Daniels. You're just another killer." A cold sweat broke out across Marcus's forehead as his chest tightened. This wasn't just a threat. This was an attack on everything he had ever stood for. The guilt, the shame, the years of struggling to atone for the things he had done. Now, they were laid bare in front of him, exposed by the very people he had tried so hard to forget. The man stood up, towering over Marcus now. "We have enough dirt on you to bury you for good," he said, his voice taking on a darker tone. "But I think we can do more than that. We're going to make you beg, Daniels. We're going to break you in ways you can't even imagine." Marcus's body went rigid. He could feel the rage building within him, the fury of being manipulated, of being forced to relive his worst nightmare. But there was something deeper, something far more dangerous than anger. There was fear, the fear that he wouldn't be able to withstand it, the fear that these men might succeed in breaking him. The door suddenly burst open, and the sound of shouting filled the room. Marcus barely had time to react before he was grabbed by the arm and dragged away. His mind was a blur of confusion and adrenaline as he struggled against their grip, but they were too strong. His body was a battleground now, his emotions in chaos, his resolve tested as never before. Just before they reached the hallway, the lights flickered. For a split second, everything went dark. Then a scream, a gut-wrenching scream that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. The lights flickered back on. A figure stood in the doorway, someone unexpected. But who? The tension in the room was thick, the silence deafening as Marcus's heart raced. What was happening? Who had come to his aid? But before he could make sense of it, the door slammed shut, and the room fell into an eerie, suffocating silence. The air felt thick with dread. The only sound was the echo of Marcus's breathing. What was about to happen?